It's Jen with Polar Pro, and we've got a new GoPro. This is the HERO9 Black, and we're gonna walk through the ideal settings for cinematic footage. So navigate to video mode and open up your presets. We'll start editing the top preset, Standard. Presets are useful because they allow you to quickly switch between your preferred settings for different circumstances. We'll start with the resolution and frame rate. Now on the HERO9 Black, we have the option to shoot up to 4K 60 or 5K 30. I like shooting at the highest resolution possible because it gives the most information and allows me to crop in post if needed. Next we'll look at lens, and you have a couple options for this setting. You can shoot in wide, linear with horizon leveling, or narrow. I'm going to stick with linear because this gives the most field of view while taking away some of that distorted fisheye look that GoPros are known for. Next is HyperSmooth, which I have set to on to give my image that stabilization. If you're shooting something with a lot of movement, you can even consider bumping that up to boost. Just know that it will crop in your image a little bit more to achieve that extra stabilization. So here we have some new features on the HERO9. You may or may not need these depending on what you're shooting, so we'll run through them really quickly. Scheduled capture allows you to set a specific time to start recording. Duration will determine how long the camera records. And hindsight will allow you to record not only when you press the shutter, but for a determined time period beforehand as well. The timer is a self-timer you can set for selfies or group shots, and zoom gives you a digital zoom to punch in your image. We don't need any of these right now, so I'll keep them off. Scrolling down, we'll move into the Pro Tune section, and we'll start with bitrate. Your two options for bitrate are standard or high. Standard will keep your file sizes lower, while high gives you better image quality. And since that's our goal in order to shoot cinematic footage, we'll keep our bitrate high and we'll make sure we use an SD card with enough space and speed to accommodate those settings. The next setting is shutter speed, and it's here I want to talk about the 180 rule. When shooting footage, it's a good rule of thumb to keep your shutter speed at double your frame rate, because this creates the most natural looking motion blur. So since we're shooting at 30 frames per second, I'm going to set my shutter speed at 1/60. If you leave your shutter at auto, the camera will decide your shutter speed based on the amount of light in the image, not your frame rate. If your shutter speed is too high, it can make the movement in your footage look jittery and unnatural. Now, if you're shooting outdoors or in really bright conditions, you might notice the slower shutter speed is starting to overexpose your image. And it's really tempting just to crank that back down to correct the exposure. But we want to keep our movement looking natural and get rid of that extra light. That's why Polar Pro makes ND filters that attach directly to the GoPro, allowing you to cut that extra light and keep your settings cinematic in any lighting condition. Now moving on, we have white balance, and it's easy to leave this at auto, let the camera decide based on the scene, but we want the most control over our image. So we're gonna go ahead and set that white balance to 45, which is a neutral middle of the road K-temp. And that's something that can be adjusted based on the scene later, but you'll be the one deciding how warm or cool you want your image to be instead of the camera. It's a similar situation with ISO, which is artificial light. Instead of letting the camera decide how much light is going to be in a scene, we're gonna make that call using the other settings we put in place. So I'm gonna keep my ISO minimum at 100 and my maximum at 200. It's a little bit of wiggle room, but not enough that the camera is making jumps mid-shoot, mid-scene, and throwing off the continuity of your images. You can always go back and change these if a shot does need more light, but that's on you to decide, not the camera. A few last settings. Down at the end we have sharpness that I'm going to keep at low. You can always add more sharpening in post, but if we bake it into our image, we don't have the option to change it later. In color we have two choices, GoPro and flat. Flat is a more neutral color profile. It's going to give you more dynamic range. You're less likely to lose information in the blacks and the whites, and that allows you to add the contrast and color back in post, giving you more flexibility. The last two options are audio and wind. I've left these at their default setting. You might just need to play around and see what's most important to you, especially if you are dealing with sound. I don't tend to shoot with audio on a GoPro, so I'm just gonna leave those as is. Here at the bottom we have shortcuts, and these are the 4 settings that are going to live on your main screen. So they're the ones that you know you're going to want to change the most often. I've picked shutter, white balance, lens, and HyperSmooth. But depending on what you're shooting, you can pick the 4 that are going to be most helpful to you. So these are my settings for cinematic footage on the GoPro HERO9. If you have any questions or want more information on some of these settings, drop us a comment below. We'd be happy to help you out. Now go out there, capture perfection, make some cool stuff.